Hey patrons, welcome back to another tutorial series. In this one we're going to be doing a monochromatic watercolour portrait painting. Here you can see the final result from this tutorial series, and this is what we are going to be creating. So I'm going to be using the Cotman watercolour set, but you can use any watercolours that you want. And I wanted to do a series where I just use one colour for this painting. Now I wanted the colour to be a very dark blue, so to get my perfect colour I mixed together Payne's grey, a bit of black and also some turquoise to give more of a blue pop to it. I wanted it to be a shade of blue but really deep and not too vibrant, so I only mixed in a little bit of turquoise, but mostly I mixed Payne's grey and black. So now what I've mixed up has got hardly any water in it, and this is going to be our darkest shade. So to get lighter values, we mix in more and more water. I'm starting off by pre-wetting the background. That is what we're going to be working on in this first part. So I've just got some clean water on my brush and I'm just applying that to the left-hand side of the background. And I'm going to be working on the background in two steps. Firstly, I'll be working on this left side and then I'll move on to doing the exact same thing with the right hand side as well. Now, I am painting Nancy from Stranger Things. I've also done 11. I'm on a bit of a Stranger Things craze at the moment and I've been enjoying doing some fan art. And so she is in woods and I wanted this to be a nice expressive painting, so I'm not including lots of detail. That is why I'm using the wet on wet technique, and I just wanted to give a basic sort of look of a few trees in the background. So I'm starting by intensifying some of the colours and I'm working on the ground, and when I'm painting in the ground I'm basically going in horizontal lines and I'm just tapping the colour into the background, and you can see that it's nicely spreading out and getting that really nice wet on wet look to it because the paper is already wet, and this means that you won't get any harsh edges. It's all going to look very nice and soft and blurred out. I'm also painting loosely in some trees, and you can see I'm giving them a bit of a curve as well. I'm not just doing them straight. And to get these really light values, you just pick up a little less paint on your brush. Whereas if you want to get this really dark, intense value, then you pull up some more paint, you get some more paint from that pan onto your brush. And when the paint disperses into the rest of the water around it, the colour is going to get lighter and lighter. So when you apply the paint it will look very dark, but as it bleeds out it will get a bit lighter. So you will need to keep going in and darkening up these colours. You can see that when I'm painting the trees I'm going vertically, whereas when I'm painting the ground I'm going horizontally to create those two different surfaces. Well, the main ground surface and then the trees as well. So I start by working really light, as you can see, doing those light washes, and then I go in and I drop in some more intense shadows. And that's all I'm doing for the background. So now I'm going over to the right hand side and I'm just pre-wetting the whole of this side. And because I've been mixing my paint, washing my paint out in my jar, you can see that this actually adds a very light wash of blue to the whole of that background. Because there's a little bit of paint in my jar, the water is a little bit dirty. So this is already adding a really light wash to the whole of that background on the right hand side. I'm being very careful as I work around the face. I definitely don't want to wet the face at all. I don't want any of this colour to bleed onto the skin. And once again, I'm just picking up some of that paint onto my brush and I'm just dropping it anywhere where I can see shadows in the reference. I'm painting in those trees. And then I'm going horizontally to paint in the ground as well. If you do get any paint on the skin by accident, then you can go in with a tissue and just lift it up. And it's important to do that whilst the paint is still wet. So you can see that I'm able to get this really light blue value because I've got hardly any paint left on my brush. but as soon as I pick up more of that paint, it gets a lot darker and more intense. Now you don't have to blend this out, it will blend itself out because the surface is wet, so you don't have to worry about blending this out, it will give a really nice soft finish. I'm going in with a lot more paint to get some really intense dark trees in there. I wanted to have a lot of contrast in the background, so I wanted to make sure that I do include these intense dark blue tones, as well as having those lighter values in between as well. You can see that I am leaving some gaps. I'm not adding the blue everywhere. I do want to leave little bits of the white of the paper showing through to add that variety of values so it's not just all dark blue. And bear in mind that the colour is going to bleed out a little bit. So the paint is going to travel a bit further than where you've applied it. Just randomly going throughout the ground and creating those horizontal lines. Just tapping the paint onto that wet surface. And I'm just loosely following the reference at this point. We will have to follow the reference more closely when we're painting the portrait, but for the background you can be a bit more expressive. And now intensifying the trees even more by picking up even more of that paint onto my brush, saturating my brush with that thick paint. And I'm adding some more shadows throughout the ground as well. Now I'm quickly switching back over to the left hand side whilst it's still wet, and I'm going in and I'm just intensifying some of the trees over here. Once I've let that sort of set for a few minutes, you can see that it did get a bit lighter, so then I went and added in some more of these darker tones. And one thing to bear in mind with watercolours is that they do dry lighter than what they appear when they're wet. So even though the paint might look really nice, really dark and intense when it's wet, it will dry a bit lighter. So bear that in mind when you're picking your colours and deciding whether you need to go darker. Once again, I'm just building up more and more of those shadows, particularly on the trees, focusing the paint in the centre of the tree, and then just letting it spread out itself. And I love the little white bits showing through. It really helps to add contrast to this painting. Adding in some darker tones throughout the ground. I will be using the salt effect with this as well to give it more of a cool texture. So we'll be doing that in a minute, but I just want to make sure that I'm happy with the shadows first. That I'm happy that I've got all of these areas as dark as they need to be. So now I'm going to go in with some table salt. You can use any salt that you have, and I'm just going to sprinkle this throughout the background. It's important that you do this whilst the painting is still wet. If your painting is too dry, then it just won't work. And also, if it isn't working, then it might be your paper. I've noticed that this effect doesn't work on certain types of paper. So I'm just sprinkling it in between the trees and throughout the ground. And this is going to add like a snowy, starry effect to the background. So I'm targeting mine particularly on the white areas. You can see already that it's creating that cool effect. Now I do want to darken up the trees even more, so I'm mixing up some more paint using the black and the Payne's grey and a little bit of turquoise. Because I want it to be even darker, I'm adding a bit more black to this. And I'm just going to tap that in the middle of the trees just like I did before. And because we want this to be really dark and intense, mix in hardly any water into your paint. You don't need to add much water at all. Just going vertically as I'm painting in these trees. And it's important that you still do this whilst the painting is wet, otherwise it won't bleed out. So if your painting is dry and it's not working like this, it's not bleeding out, it's creating harsh edges, then wait for everything to completely dry and then re-wet the background once it's completely dry, and then you can tap in some more shadows. But try to work as quickly as possible when you're doing this. I really do recommend mixing out your paint before you pre-wet the background so that you don't have to then mix the paint, as that wastes a bit of time. So I'm working some shadows throughout the left hand side, and I'm also adding some shadows throughout the ground as well, going horizontally. Now it would have been best to do this before I added in the salt, but I only decided after that I wanted to add in some more intense shadows. So I'm just adding some shadow throughout the ground now, right at the bottom, just tapping it in, going horizontally. And I'm adding even more shadow once again to those trees, just dabbing it throughout the middle of the trunks. And I'm just going to add a bit more salt wherever I want that effect to be more pronounced. But that is pretty much it for the background. Now, before we move on to the face, it's important that you wait for this all to dry. So welcome back to part 2 of this tutorial series, and I'm starting off by using my masking fluid pen to mask off the highlights throughout the portrait. So you can use normal masking fluid. I really like the Monochrome masking fluid pen as it allows me to get in these tiny details. And I just masked off the highlights in the eyes, the little bit of highlight on the earring, and some of the white stripes on her shirt. But if you don't have masking fluid, don't worry, you can just add in these highlights later on with some gouache. So I'm starting off by adding a light layer of water, which as you can see has got a little tinge of blue to it, just like when we did the background. And I'm going to add this throughout the entire face, apart from the eyes. Now I'm avoiding the eyes because I don't want any colour to bleed into them. But I am wetting over the eyebrows, over the nose and over the mouth. So just add a light layer of this water all over the face and over the neck as well. And this is going to give us a really nice base layer because it's got a slight tinge of blue, so this will be great for those highlights, and it will just give us a nice base layer to work on top of. Be quite quick as you're doing this so that you don't get any harsh edges forming. So whilst I wait for that base layer on the skin to dry, I'm going to start to work on the clothing. So I'm going to apply the exact same layer of water to the fur collar around her jacket. So I'm just pre-wetting both sides of this fur collar. And for this I'm using my silver black velvet paintbrush. And I'm using quite a large brush so that it's quicker to fill in and to pre-wet these areas. If you were to use a small paintbrush, then it would take a lot longer. And as we know, when we're doing the wet on wet technique, speed is really important. It's important that you do things quickly, but you're not rushing them. You're very intentional with what you're doing. So her fur collar is white, but even though it's very light, there are still some shadows in there. So I had the idea that I wanted to make this look really loose and expressive, but get in that fur sort of texture. So I'm going to go in with salt to create the look of the fur collar. But to do that, I do need to add in some shadows so that it's not just white, because if I was to add the salt on just a white area, then it's not going to have any depth. So I'm just going throughout the fur and I'm just tapping in some of that blue, adding some mid-tones and then some more intense shadows. I'm mainly adding the shadows where they are in the reference. For example, there's quite this dark shadow where the fur collar is meeting the shirt around the edge. And I'm just creating that tapping motion, which also helps to give the texture of that fluffy, furry fleece look to it. I'm just building up even more shadows as I go by grabbing more and more paint onto my brush. So I'm not mixing in water if I want a lighter value, I'm just picking up less paint onto my brush. If I want a really light value, then I just pull up a tiny bit of paint just onto the tip of my brush. Whereas if I want this really dark, intense colour, you can see that I pulled up a bit more paint. I'm just tapping some more shadows throughout the middle. And so now that I've added in some basic shadows, I'm just going to add salt all over the fur collar so that as this dries, it creates that really cool texture and gives that fleecy woolen look to it. So I'm just using my table salt, and make sure that you're doing this whilst the paint is still wet. So work quite quickly as you do this. And just sprinkle it throughout this area, being careful not to get it on the skin at all. So now I'm going to repeat the same process with the other side. Because this side had already dried a bit, I pre-wet the whole of this area once again, and then I repeated the exact same steps that I did with the left hand side. So I'm creating that shadow directly by the shirt. And I'm looking for the reference, I'm looking at the reference to see where the darkest shadows are throughout this collar. And I'm just tapping in that blue. Remember, we want this to look very nice and expressive, so you don't have to apply too much detail. Just get in the general gist of where the shadows are. So I'm adding the shadow where those two separate bits of the collar meet. And I'm getting that shadow underneath the collar. That shadow that's being cast onto the jacket. And the jacket is quite dark, so I'm filling that in with a darker blue. It's only the fur collar that's quite light. The rest of the jacket is quite a dark value. I'm painting in the bit of the sleeve, and I'm going to continue to work in some shadows and dab in some shadows throughout the fur collar so that when we have the salt and when we add the salt, it has more shadows so that the effect is more apparent. So now I'm just going to sprinkle the salt all over that fur collar, just like I did with the left hand side, being careful not to get it on the jacket part, that dark part of the jacket, because that isn't that fleece texture, it's like a leather texture, so we want that to look smooth. And now I'm using my Arteza brush pen, but you can use your paintbrush if you want, and I'm just going in and I'm adding a lot more shadow to the jacket part, using quite a lot of paint to get that really dark, intense shadow. Pulling up some more paint. You can see how just adding that shadow gives a much more realistic look. Makes it have a lot more depth. Now I'm going over to the other side and I'm just outlining the shoulder part of the jacket as well. And I'll fill in those white areas with a lighter wash of that blue. Just by dipping my brush pen into the water a bit, just to dilute it a bit more. Intensifying the shadows right by the fur collar. So whilst that's drying, I'm going to work on the rest of the clothing. So her jumper is quite dark, so she's got a sort of stripy checkered shirt on, and then she's got this jumper, and then she's got her jacket on. So I'm just filling in the jumper portion with a really dark value, which means I'm using a lot of that paint on my brush pen. Not adding any water, just taking it directly from the palette, and because we want that darker value, we're pulling up even more onto the brush pen. What's good about the brush pen is that it has water in the tube, so if you do want to create a gradient and you want to apply the paint and then make it a lighter wash, you can squeeze on the tube and it releases some water so that you can blend everything out. I'm now working on the shirt, just outlining around those collars. And then I'm using a bit more water just to blend out that middle portion of the shirt, just by squeezing on the pen to release a bit more water. So you can see how that value for the shirt is slightly lighter than the value of the jumper. And you can see already how the salt is working on the collars to give that really nice fleece effect to them. And you can see that because we've got in those shadows, that texture is even more apparent. So I'm just doing the same process throughout the collars of the shirt, just using my brush pen to add in quite a dark base value. And then I'm going to get lighter as we go further down the collar by using a bit more water. So I'm squeezing the pen and I'm just pulling down that colour onto the rest of the collar. I'm just going to fill all of that in just to create that really nice base layer. And now I'm just using some water to actually create a couple of highlights. So I'm just squeezing the tube a little bit and the water will help to highlight those areas. As you can see, I'm creating some little striped highlights. I'm now picking up a bit more paint and adding some shadow under where we've got that masking fluid to darken up the collar, and I'm pulling that further down towards the bottom section, intensifying some of those shadows even more and intensifying the area of the shirt in between the collars. Adding a shadow underneath that left collar. And you can see if we look at the background how the salt has created a really cool effect with that as well. I'm intensifying the jumper even more with some darker paint, with less water. And I'm going to repeat the same process with the other collar, just starting off by adding a very light base tone to the collar. So what I love about doing these monochrome paintings is that you can really focus on value. You don't have to worry about mixing up lots of different colours, so it saves you time and it's a bit less overwhelming when you're trying to do the wet on wet technique. So I recommend doing these types of studies if you're new to watercolours and you want to get a feel for the wet on wet technique without having to rush to mix lots of different colours together. It really helps you focus on values and depth and contrast in your painting because you've only got one hue to worry about. And they're really fun to do, and I think they give a really nice look and effect. So now I'm intensifying the colours just like I did with the other one. Adding some lines to create that checkered effect. Darkening up under the masking fluid. And so I'm just going to repeat this process of darkening up this collar, just like I did with the other side, until I finished it, and then we'll move on to the next step. Now that we've finished working on the clothing, I'm going to go in again and add a base layer to the skin. So once again, just picking up some water from my jar, and I'm just adding this throughout the whole of the face, once again missing out the eyes. And as you can see, it's creating that darker blue tone because of the fact that the water's got a little bit of colour in it now, but that's fine because there isn't really bright highlights throughout the portrait. So just go ahead and add this base tone to the whole of the skin and the neck. Now that we've added our base wash of colour to the skin, it's time to go in and build up the shadows. Now, to make sure that our shadows look really nice and smooth and that the skin looks smooth, we need to work quickly whilst the paint is still wet and whilst this first wash of colour is still nice and wet. So I was going to use my brush pen to add in these shadows, but I realised after a little bit that it wasn't working as well as I wanted because more water is coming out. It's harder to get that nice soft finish. So I switched over to my normal paintbrush instead. I am going to be using a slightly smaller paintbrush as this is a smaller area that we're working on. but you still don't want a paintbrush that is too small, otherwise it will take longer, so the paint will dry faster and you might not have time to work on the whole area. So you can see that this paintbrush is a little bit smaller. Now there was a lot of shadow on the left hand side of her face, so that's where we're going to be starting first, and I am going to be building this up in layers. So I didn't want to go too dark straight away, I prefer to work in layers and gradually build up the shadows. So a lot of the shadow was over on her cheeks and on the side of her face where the skin meets the hair as well. So I'm just picking up a little more of that colour onto my paintbrush, not too much. And remember, the more that you add onto your brush, the darker it's going to be. Whereas if you just pull up a little bit of paint onto your brush, it's going to give you that lighter value. Now I'm just basically tapping in this paint wherever I can see the darker shadows are on the reference. And it will bleed out to give a really soft finish as long as the paper is wet. And you won't have to blend it out too much at all. So there's quite a lot of shadow around her left eye, so between the eye and the eyebrows and under the eye a little bit, and that shadow basically continues down onto her cheekbones to give that contoured look to the cheekbones where there's that hollow in the cheekbones. And I'm blending it down towards the jawline as well. I'm picking up a bit more paint onto my brush and I'm going to intensify that even further, because if you look at the reference you can see that these shadows are actually quite dark. Picking up a bit more paint and I'm just going to keep building up more and more of that shadow until I'm happy with how it's looking for this first layer. So I'm just going to blend out this darker shadow a bit more, bring it higher up onto the forehead, onto the side of the forehead. And work it further into the middle. Make sure you keep evaluating the reference, seeing the shape of the shadows. That's important to give the face the right structure. So if you see me stopping, it's because I'm checking the reference. I'm picking up a bit more blue now, and I'm going to add it to those darker shadows on the side of the face, and I'm pulling it further around the eye. We definitely need to darken up around this eye. Now you want to make sure that you're not adding a lot of water to your brush, just pick up the paint from the pan and add it to the painting. If you start adding water to your brush, then it might create those little blooms of water, that cauliflower effect, and you definitely don't want that. So don't mix in water with your paint, just pull up more or less paint onto your brush and mix it onto the wet surface. That's the best way to avoid the cauliflower effect. So I'm bringing the shadow further towards the mouth, and you can see directly underneath the mouth in the reference there is this dark shadow. So I'm just going to fill that in with a light watercolour now with not too much paint. I'm just blending out that shadow for the cheekbone. We'll also need to add the shadow to the side of the nose as well. But don't worry, we can build this up in multiple layers. So if you notice that your painting is starting to dry out, wait for it to completely dry, then pre-wet the face again, and then carry on. So I'm darkening up that shadow underneath the mouth and darkening up the jawline as well. You can see how I'm not rushing this. I am going quite slow. Be very intentional where you're going to put the paint. Some papers do dry faster than others. I do find that the cold press paper does dry slightly slower than the hot press, so that's why I like using it for this, so that I have a bit more time. I'm adding a bit more shadow to the jawline and to the neck a bit as well. And remember, as the paint spreads out, it does get lighter. And when it dries even lighter. So the shadows may look quite dark, but don't worry, they won't be dark when they dry out. Adding some more shadow just on the outer corner of the mouth. And I'm really looking at the reference to look at the shapes of these shadows and how they connect with other parts of the face. Just blending those two shadows together. Pulling up some more paint to darken up that shadow underneath the lips. Just slightly darkening up that shadow along the jawline. Now I'm adding the shadow above the lips. So I'm darkening up the shadow around the eye as well. And really I'm just pulling up more and more paint onto my brush, and I'm gradually making the shadows darker and darker until the paint isn't wet enough for the colours to bleed out. Then I'll stop and wait for it to dry. So I'm just going to continue for the next few minutes to build up these shadows even more by picking up more paint onto my brush. I'm going to add the shadow to the side of the nose as well. Now the nose is more highlighted in the middle, so I'm just adding shadow to the side. And around the side of the nose as well. Now don't worry about the sketch outline, we will be covering it up because we do need to go a lot darker with these values. I'm going to darken up the jaw even more. And like I said, I'm just going to keep working on these shadows until I'm happy with them. I really wanted to go in and darken up the cheekbones and around the eyes even more before I let this layer dry. So I've pulled up quite a lot of paint onto my brush and I'm just going to apply that to the cheekbones and around the eyes. Now this paper is starting to get a little bit dry, so I've got to work quite quickly and I may need to help to blend this out myself. So I'm just adding some really dark shading around the eye. Being careful to look at the reference and see exactly where that shadow ends and the shape of it. And I'm going to bring that shadow for the cheekbone further across and further down as well to meet the jawline. You see that I'm just slowly blending it out, and you won't want to use water to blend this out, just use your brush. Bring that shadow up towards the corner of the mouth and by the chin. And I'm just going to blend out around the eye as well. I'm also going to add a layer of that colour over the top of the eyebrows. I'm going to darken up the side of the face as well. So you can see that I made the mistake of doing exactly what I said not to do, and I went in with a brush that I added more water to, and you can see how it does mess up your shading. So I quickly worked to fix that by cleaning my brush and making sure it wasn't wet, and then I'm just going to go and blend all of that out. But that's when I realized that that was not a good idea to do. So never add more water to your brush and then try and blend things out with more water. It just doesn't work. So you can see how it's created that weird bloom effect by the nose. It's okay, we can fix that. Just using a clean, damp brush, but not wet. I'm just going to blend over this whole area. We need to go a lot darker on this left hand side of the face anyway. Another thing that you may have seen there was a drop of water from midway up my brush dropped on the side of the nose, and you can see that it's created that weird bloom effect, so I've got to fix that as well. So don't worry if you make mistakes with watercolours, as long as you know how to fix them, it should be fairly easy to get it back on track, as long as you work quickly and just blend it out. It shows how easy it is to make a mistake with this. What I should have done was waited for it to dry and then pre-wet it again, rather than trying to work whilst it was just damp, because the colours then didn't bleed out completely when I added in those dark shadows. So it would have been better for me to wait, let it all dry, then I could have added in those darker colours without any of this. It's important to leave these bits in so that you guys can see how mistakes can occur and also how to fix them as well. Because as beginners, we run into these problems all the time. So this shows that it's definitely better to wait for the painting to dry if the paper is not quite wet enough, and then just build up a second layer without having to do all of this. So now I'm going to darken up the side of the nose on this side. I mean, I wasn't too worried about that layer because I know I need to go a lot darker anyway. So I was just going to wait for that to dry and then I could just correct it when I have to add more paint. And the reason I'm adding more colour on this side without pre-wetting the whole area is because I know I'm going to add this wash to this whole area. So I'm adding just a flat wash of colour there. So it didn't have to be the wet and wet method. I'm also going to add a wash of colour just above this eye. Just underneath the eyebrow. Picking up some more paint and I'm just going to fill in this lighter area. Once again, we can fix that later on. Going to pick up a bit more paint and just start to add some shadow underneath the eye, and we can work on this section now because we've just added that base wash, so this area will be nice and wet for us to add our shadows to while still being able to get that really nice smooth finish. Adding some darker paint, adding more paint underneath the eyes. And to the side of the nose as well. And I'm also going to darken up that section between the eyebrow and the upper crease of the eye as well. Filling in the eyebrow. Now I'm going in with a light wash of colour and I'm just adding the shadow at the bottom of the nose, around the nostrils. So this area was still quite wet, so I was able to add this wash of colour in. Because I'm not adding a really dark, intense colour, I'm just adding a light wash, the paint can freely move around. Because the paper is still quite wet, it just wasn't wet enough for that really dark colour to blend out as much as I needed it to. Now I'm picking up some more intense blue and I'm just going to darken up the shadow for the tip of the nose even more. And also along the side of the nose. And you can see how now the sketch is a lot more covered up. So I'm just going to continue to darken up that shadow. Now I want to start to work on the next layer of shading for the skin. So I'm going to darken up the jawline and underneath the mouth. And I'm basically going to add a layer of water to the whole of the skin so that we can smooth everything out. So I'm just darkening up the jawline. And when I wet over everything, I can add more dark, intense shadows and use that to help cover up all of our mistakes from the last layer, to give really nice smooth skin. So I'm adding shadow underneath the mouth. So now I'm going to start to go in with more water, and I'm just going to pre-wet the whole of the skin. And don't worry if it starts to look messy at this point. We just want to wet everywhere so that we can use the wet on wet technique. I'm going to try and keep it as smooth as possible. I'm just working my way across the whole of the skin, just wetting the whole area. And then I'll be back to talk you guys through the next step. Now that we've gone and we've wet the whole of the skin again, we can go in and intensify these shadows and make everything nice and smooth. So I'm just going in with some darker paint, and I'm just going to start off by adding this around the eyes. And now that everything's nice and wet, it will bleed out to give a really soft finish. So in the future, make sure that you let areas dry before layers without trying to just go in and add shadows whilst the paper's wet and then trying to blend it out. That don't work, as I have come to realise. Sometimes you just think, oh, it'll be okay, and then you land in a even harder situation to correct. So it's worth, even if you're unsure, just let it dry completely. It can be very tempting to want to just carry on and not wait for it to dry. But if you want to speed up for something drying, you can always use a hairdryer. It's better to use it on a cool setting, especially if you're using masking fluid. And that will help speed up the drying process so that you can carry on straight away. So I'm just darkening up the side of the nose, and basically I'm going to be darkening up all of the areas that I added shadows to in the first layer. So I'm darkening up the side of the nose, and I'll also need to darken up by the nostrils as well. So I'm adding more shadow to this underneath section of the nose. Once again around the side of the nose. And I'm adding even more shadow underneath the eyes. So now I'm going to build up some more shadow on the cheeks. This is probably one of the darkest shadows on the skin. So I want to intensify that even more. It's pretty much the same value as the shadow around the eyes, so I want to make them match. I'm bringing that shadow further down. And I'm just using the exact same technique as I did in the first layer before I tried to blend it out with water. You can see how already this is softening the skin out a lot more. I'm also darkening up the jawline because this area is quite dark. Her jawline is also very sharp, so I want to make sure that I give her the correct jawline shape. because I find that it's one of her like key features that makes her look like her. I'm going to darken up around the eyes even more. And around the side of the nose. Darkening up the shadow where the nostrils are. And I'm going to darken up above this other eye. Also darkening up underneath the eye. I'm just using a clean brush to blend this out. I haven't got more water on my brush, I've just got a clean, damp brush. Just so that we have no harsh outlines. So now I'm also using a clean damp brush to help lift up some of the colour to create more of a highlight in the centre of the nose. And as long as you don't have a really wet brush, you can put up highlights and remove the colour. So now I'm going to go in and I'm going to darken up the neck. So I'm going to add a base wash of colour all the way across the neck to add a nice base wash so that we can build up some shadows on top of it using our wet on wet technique. Because the whole of the neck is darker than the skin, so it's okay to add a dark base wash to the neck. I'm just adding a wash that is the same value as the lightest areas on the neck. Once again, try and work nice and quickly to avoid any harsh lines. I now mixed up some more of that same paint because we were getting a little thin on the palette, and I'm just intensifying the shadows on the neck by using more paint on my brush. I'm looking closely at the reference to see where the shadows are, the shape of them and how they curve with the neck. And I'm also darkening up underneath the chin as well. I'm going in with even more paint to darken it up even further. And I'm also darkening up above the collar and for the shadow on the neck right by the hair. The hair tends to cast more of a darker shadow onto the neck because it prevents the light from getting to that area. So I'm just going to continue to build up the shadows on the neck even more. Now I'm going to go in and build up a base layer to the mouth. Now the darkest part of the mouth is the central part. So I'm going in with my water brush pen, and I've got a lot of paint on the tip of that brush. And I'm just going to start to go in and add in the middle part of the lips, and also the upper lip is quite dark as well. And I'm just adding the first base wash of colour across the mouth. Now the bottom of the mouth is a little more highlighted. It's got this highlighted strip in the centre of the bottom lip. And because the skin's wet, it's starting to bleed into the skin a little bit, which is fine because we need to go a lot darker on these lips anyway. Now I'm going to go in with more paint and darken up the centre line of the lips even more. And I'm also adding the shadow to the bottom lip. Like I said, there's more of that highlighted strip in the middle of the bottom lip, so I'm leaving that highlighted for now. Not getting that as dark. Pulling up some more paint to darken up the middle of the lips even more. You can do this with a paintbrush, you don't have to use a brush pen. I just find that this is good for getting in the details and for adding that gradient wash. I'm also darkening up the upper lip a bit more, being careful to get the shape of the lips correct. And I'm going to add a little more shadow to the bottom lip as well. So when I'm doing a portrait, I do like to work on the skin and the nose and the lips first, and then do the eyes. Otherwise, the colours for the skin will bleed into the eyes if I was to wear everything, and I wouldn't get those crisp details that I need. I'm also darkening up the shadow for the nose. I'm darkening up the sides of the nose as well. Now that shadow does go up a lot higher, but it's a bit lighter. Just blending out the edge of that shadow. Picking up a bit more paint to darken up the bottom of the nose. I'm just blending out the edges of the nose. So now I'm going in and I'm wetting the whole of the skin again. You could use a bigger brush to do this. just cleaning up the jawline a bit as well. And I'm going to blend over the neck to smooth that out. Now I'm going to start to work on the hair. So I'm using a light wash of that colour. And I'm going to work on this whilst the skin dries. And I'm just adding a base wash of colour to this first section of the ponytail. And then we're going to be dropping in some darker shadows. And when I'm working on this, even though I want the hair to be expressive, I'm still following the direction the hair is going in. I'm working on it in terms of sections. And I'm going in strokes that are lines going with the way the hair curves. Like I said, I am going to give the hair more of an expressive look. The main way I'll be doing this is I'll be adding droplets of water into the shadows to give that starry effect. I'm adding a light wash of colour to the neck section now. Just filling in the whole section. You don't have to worry about the direction the hair is going in when you're just adding in a base wash. You can just fill it all in, being careful to go around the ear. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the top part of the hair. Going around the ear. And I'm just going to work on adding this base wash of colour to the whole of the hair. Now that I've added in a base wash of colour everywhere, it's time to build up more shadows. So I'm going to go in with more paint on my brush and just start to create some lines to indicate the direction the hair is going in within each section. You can see that with my sketch outline, I've already sketched in some basic lines, so I'm just basically painting over these to give an indication at the way the hair is flowing. So you can see I'm following those sketch outlines with lots of paint on my brush to give a nice intense shadow. Try and keep it nice and loose, and you don't have to do lots of lines to indicate the direction of the hair. Keep in mind that as the paint spreads, it is going to become lighter, So even though this paint looks dark, we definitely need to go a lot darker with this. Also keep in mind where the highlights are within the hair. Those are areas that you'll want to avoid any shadows, adding any shadows to. I'm going in with a lot more paint, just intensifying those shadows even more, building up more and more shadows. And I'm going to repeat the same process on the right hand side of the hair, that little bit that we can see. I'm also going to repeat the same process for the ponytail, just blocking in these shadows. You can see how little water I've got mixed in because it's barely moving on the paper, it's so thick. So I'm just getting a little bit of water just to be able to move the paint freely around the page. And I'm just darkening up that ponytail, making sure to go in lines. So I'm just going to repeat this process until I've got in all of the shadows. So I'm building up an even darker layer of shadows in the hair, and I mixed in more black into my paint so that I could get this really dark colour. So I used the same colours, just a bit more black to give it a really nice dark rich shadow. Once again, I'm just going to repeat the same process. Like I said earlier, I want the hair to look nice and expressive, so I am going to go in and add in droplets of water into the hair to give that starry effect. So to do this, I'm going to load my paintbrush up with just clean water, and I'm simply going to tap that into the painting. So I've got some water on my brush. You can see that I'm just tapping it in, and you'll see how quickly the water will drip and disperse through that darker paint, that thicker paint. You can see how it's dripping, and it will give that really nice cool effect to the hair. I'm going to do the same thing throughout the ponytail, just literally tapping in clean water into that really dark shadowed areas. And I'm also adding some more shadow over the top of the forehead, just to tie the hairline in with the skin a bit more. Just smoothing out that hairline. And I'm just tapping in a little bit of paint to merge that hairline in with the skin. Also splattering some water into the hair. Now I'm going to start to work on the ear, and I'm starting off by going in with a very light wash of that blue, and I'm just going to fill in all of those shadowed areas, just with a flat wash of colour. And I'm leaving out all of the lighter areas for now. I'm just blocking in these little shadowed sections on the inside of the ear, just using my small paintbrush. So I'm adding that light wash of colour everywhere now. I'm going to go in with more shadows and just tap these into the darker sections. I'm also adding a few little more bits of wisps of hair over onto the face. Just evaluating the reference image. And now I'm going to start to work on the eyes. So I'm first going to add a very light wash of that blue over the whole of the eyes, even the whites of the eyes. And even though you may think the white of the eyes is really light, it's actually got quite a bit of shadow to it. So now I'm just using a clean brush to blend over that. Clean damp brush, just to stain that a little bit. Working a bit more paint throughout the white of the eyes, throughout those little corners either side. Just blending over that. And you'll want to make sure the skin is nice and dry before you start to work on the eyes, otherwise the colours will bleed out everywhere. Darkening up the tear duct for this right eye, and I'm going to start to darken up the upper lash line. I'm also going to go around the sides of the iris and just add a flat wash of colour for the whole of the iris. And I'm going to repeat the same process on the other side for this other eye. And just before I let this layer completely dry, I'm just going to go in with my brush and just clean up the side of the nose by going in and darkening it up. I just want to stain this to be a little bit darker. So I added in some dark paint, and now I'm just going to dab over the top of it with that tissue just to stain it a little bit. Now I'm going back in with the brush, and I'm just adding more shadow to the darkest points, to the darkest shadows on the nose. I'm also going to darken up the underneath part of the nose by the nostrils. And I'm not going to work any more on the eyes yet until the whole thing has dried. So once you've finished adding the shadows to the nose, just wait for everything to completely dry. So now that everything has dried, let's go in and let's pre-wet the whole of the face again and the neck. And we're going to start to work on another layer of shading on the skin. So this time I did wait for everything to dry before I started to go in and add more shadows on the skin, so that we won't have any more problems with this. And I'm just wetting over the whole of the face. Even over onto the hair a little bit. Just make sure that you've wet everything nice and evenly and that you've added water everywhere. If you do it quickly, then you may not notice areas that you haven't added water to until the paint sort of disperses and doesn't go on those areas. You can get a weird texture, so make sure you've wet the whole of the face. And now I'm going to go in with some really dark paint and start to get in these dark shadows now. So I want to make sure the shadows are really nice and intense, so no messing around now. We're going to go in with some really dark paint and really intensify them. And because everything's nice and wet, everything will blend out beautifully on its own. I'm going to darken up around the eyes and around the side of the nose. And I'm not adding any new shadows, I'm just darkening up the ones that we've already blocked in with some thicker paint, with more paint on my brush. Really going to darken up around the eyes. And if your painting is still looking a little unsmooth from previous layers, then This layer will definitely fix everything because we're going quite dark now. Just going over the eyebrows as well. I'm bringing that paint further down underneath the eye. Going in with some more paint. Darkening up the side of the skin, the side of the face, and also that shadow on the cheek. Bringing that shadow further down to meet the jawline. And I'm going to darken up underneath the mouth as well. So I'm going to blend those shadows further out so we don't have these big white gaps. So I'm just going to blend over them because this whole left side is still pretty dark. Also going to blend out the top of the forehead, mainly around the sides of the forehead as well. The highlight for the forehead tends to be in the center of the forehead, so above where that nose is. There is going to be this shadow on the side that's getting lighter and lighter as we head towards the middle. I'm also adding a subtle shadow above the nose. And don't be scared to go in with some dark colours if that is what the value is in the reference image. Picking up some more paint, darkening up the jawline. And I'm also darkening up the neck as well. Adding that shadow for the neck. Once again, I'm marking in the darkest shadows and contours on the neck as well. So I'm just going to continue for a bit to build up even more shadows throughout the skin and the neck. I'm going to add a bit more paint above the eyes and I'm going to darken up the eyebrows as well. And I really want to get around the eyes as intense as it needs to be. So I'm making sure that I'm going in with a lot of paint to really darken up this whole area. I'm also working a little bit of this paint above the eye on that upper lash line. But mainly I'm focusing it above the eye in that space between the eye and the eyebrow. I've got lots of paint on my brush and I'm just blocking in the eyebrow once again with this darker value. And you can see how, because the paper is still wet, it's nicely bleeding out to give a nice soft but intense shadow. I want the shadow to be restricted to this area, so I don't want it to bleed out too much. I just need it to be softened around the edges and not be harsh lines. Like I mentioned earlier, the shadow around the eye is the same value as the shadow for the cheeks, so we will need to darken up the cheeks as well. I'm just softening out the edge of that shadow a bit more. I'm just filling a bit more shadow just over that upper eyelid, the first half. And I'm going to bring that shadow further down the nose, down the side of the nose. Just working on the shadow on the side of the nose, making sure to keep the middle part of the nose nice and highlighted. I'm just wetting the forehead again. I'm just blending out the edges of the shadow for the nose. I'm getting more paint on my brush and I'm going to darken up the cheeks. So this shadow and this contour for the cheekbones. And I'm going to bring this shadow further near the ear and further down as well. I'm also darkening up the outer corner of the mouth. And I'm just going to smooth out this shadow. Darkening up the jawline. And by the chin. Now I'm going to bring that shadow up further. Also need to darken up underneath the mouth. So I'm going to darken that up now. And I'm just going to blend these two shadows together. Also filling in that lighter area to darken that up a bit. Because the values between the shadow and the highlights by that ear wasn't really drastic, they're quite a similar value. Just smoothing out all of these shadows using a clean brush. And so I'm just going to keep smoothing this out until I'm happy with it. Now that I'm happy with how the skin is looking, I'm going to start to work on the eyes a bit more. So we definitely need to go a lot darker with these eyes. So I'm starting off by lining the upper lash line, and we're also going to need to darken up the iris and get in the pupil as well. So I've got quite a lot of paint on my brush, and I'm just very carefully outlining that upper lash line and also the upper crease as well. So I want these lines to be nice and defined, so I'm doing this whilst this layer around the eye is nice and dry so that nothing bleeds out. I'm also darkening up underneath the waterline because there's a bit of shadow there, and I'm creating a few lines for a couple of eyelashes as well, being very careful as I do that. I'm also getting in a bit of shadow for the tear duct. And we don't have to worry about going over the highlight because we have masked that off with that blue masking fluid, so it doesn't really stand out that much, but it is there. And I'm just going to go in now and getting the pupil and also the iris. So outlining the pupil and the sides of the iris to start with. I'm now going in with my brush pen, and I'm using that to blend everything out and to fill in the colour for the rest of the iris. So I squeeze the brush pen a bit to get some water to come out so we can fill in the iris and also the white of the eye as well. We also need to get in the eyebrow because it's looking slightly strange and that she hasn't got an eyebrow on this side. I'm just bringing that shadow higher up above that upper crease. And once again, we are going to be working on the eye in layers. Filling in that upper eyelid. And also filling in part of the waterline and the side of the nose a bit more. Just using the tissue to lift up a bit of colour in the white of the eye, just so it's not so dark. And I'm also using a clean brush pen to lift up some of that colour as well. So I'm just lifting up the colour, dabbing it on my tissue, and then going back in to remove more colour to give a more realistic result. So as you can see, that's looking a lot better now. I'm going to pause that eye for a minute, and I'm going to start to block in the eyebrow. So I'm going to use some really dark paint for this because her eyebrows are nice and dark. And I'm just going to block it in, and you can see that I'm going in little lines to resemble the eyebrow hairs. And I'm following the direction the hairs are growing in, to give more of a natural look. We can't see much of the eyebrow on this side. And once again, I'm going to repeat the same process with the other eye. So I'm going to line the upper lash line, and I'm also going to go in and outline around the iris, the pupil, and below the waterline as well. I'll also outline the eyelid as well, that crease for the eyelid, using this thick paint, because we want this value to be nice and dark and intense. So just repeat the same process for this eye. I'm also adding another layer over the top of the eyebrow so that the value for this eyebrow matches the other one that we've just blocked in. Because on the right hand side, that eyebrow was a little bit darker, so we need to now make them match. And I'm also using this paint to darken up around the eye as well, so that skin between the eyebrow and also the eye. Once again, I'm going in with my water brush pen, and I'm using this to add a base wash of value for the rest of that iris, and just to blend all of that out to get rid of any outlines. Pulling up a bit more paints just to darken it up. And I'm also going to do a bit of shading for the white of the eye as well. So I'm just cleaning off my brush, and I'm just pulling bits of that colour in to give a nice light value to the white of the eye. Just going to darken up the white of the eye. And remember, this will look lighter when it's fully dried. If you need to lighten anything up, remember you can clean your brush pen and go in to lift up some of that colour. I'm just going to make some final details around that eye. Like I just blended out the edges if there was any harsh edges to the shading. And now I'm going to start to work on the mouth. We've already got in the base layer for the lips earlier, so now I just want to darken everything up and create this really nice crisp detail. Now that the mouth is dry, we're going to be able to get in these crisp details and these dark shadows a lot easier. So I'm first going in and I've blocked in that middle line, that really dark shadow where the bit of the mouth is open between the lips. And I'm also going in and I'm outlining that upper lip, just filling it in as well with quite a dark value. It gets a bit lighter over on the right hand side of this lip. So I'm going to create that little bit of highlight. And I'm also going to fill in the bottom lip. Like I mentioned before, this lip is a little bit lighter than the other one, so we don't need to go quite as dark for the whole thing. Also darkened up below the lip, and I'm getting in that darker shadow as well. So you can see how we still need to go even darker with all of the shading as well. So I'm just going to blend over that. Blend that away by getting lighter and lighter with my brush pen. And I'm also going to darken up the nose as well. So because again this is dry, it's going to be easier to get those sharp details. I also did add a bit of shading to the bottom lip. Sometimes when my camera stops, because it only records for a certain amount of time, you may miss a minute of footage here or there because it doesn't make a sound when it stops. And it may take me a little bit of time to notice. But trust me, you never miss much. So I'm just darkening up the side of the nose. And then I'm bringing that shadow further up, but it gets lighter as we go further up the nose. So I'm using the brush pen to create that gradient. Picking up a bit more paint. I'm just using a clean brush just to blend over that. Now I'm going to go in and I'm going to bring a little bit of that shadow around the eyes just a bit further down, and I'm also going to darken up the iris as well. So I'm picking up some more paint on my brush and I'm just going to bring that shadow a bit further round underneath the eye. And I'm going to start to darken up the crease for the eyelid and also that upper lash line, the pupil and around the iris now. Now that it's had time to dry a little bit, we can go in and add our second layer to the eyes. Actually, I think this is like the third layer on the eyes now. Just going to darken up the shadow underneath that waterline. And I'm just darkening up the sides of the iris, and this is just going to make the eyes pop even more. And it's going to add more definition to them. Just darkening up by the side of the nose, and I'm just blending that out with my brush pen if I need to. And I'm also darkening up by the tear duct. And you can see that this eye now looks a lot better. And it has more depth. I'm also darkening up the side of the nose. And I'm darkening up parts of the hair as well. We haven't got too much left to do with the actual painting, but we will be going in the next part, and we're going to be defining things more with the black watercolour pencil. So I like going in with a watercolour pencil just to add a bit more definition using my pencils. And then we'll be adding highlights with the gouache. Just darkening up the jawline. We will need to darken up the ear as well before we go in with our watercolour pencils. Just blending out by the jawline, the shadow onto the neck as well. Now I'm going to start to build up a second layer of shading on the ear. Going in with my brush pen, and I'm filling in those shadowed areas just with a darker wash of colour. Just focusing on blocking in those darker values. We've already got in the base wash for the lighter values when we did that first layer, so now it's just about darkening up the shadows even more. And find that this is easier to do with this brush pen because you can control how light or dark you want the wash by adding a bit more water if you need to for lighter values. And I'm also going to use my brush pen to darken up the shadows even more. So I'm just taking some more paint on that brush. And I'm just going to work even more shadows throughout the darkest parts of the ear. I also want to build up a few more shadows throughout the hair before we move on to the next step. Create a couple more lines throughout the hair. You don't need to add too many details because I do still want to keep this very expressive, and I will be adding a couple of details using the gouache later on as well, and also the black watercolour pencil. But you can go in and add some flyaway hairs at this stage, so a few little wispy bits of hair going over onto the face, over onto the ear if you want, and also across onto the background. So I'm just going to finish off by using my brush pen just to add in a few more brush strokes to indicate sections of the hair. Once again, I'm going to go in and add a bit more shadow to the ears, and I also want to add another layer of shading, so a bit more shadow to the mouth as well. So at this stage, I'm just making any little adjustments and tweaks that I want to make. before I call this like watercolor painting finish for this stage, before we need to add in all of the details and highlights. So I'm just darkening up the center of the lips and also portions of the upper lip. Now I'm also creating a few little markings with my brush pen to indicate little creases and texture on the lips. Darkening up the bottom lip a bit more, and as you can see I'm just doing a few of those little curved lines just to indicate texture to the lips. Darkening up the center of the mouth a bit more just to make this really pop, and I'm going in my brush pen and I'm just outlining the side of the face as well. Next, you want to allow the painting to completely dry, and we're going to go in and remove the masking fluid before we start to add in a little more shading to the areas where we've applied the masking fluid. So I'm just using a tea towel to remove the masking fluid. I find that this makes it a lot easier to remove the masking fluid and a lot quicker. We don't have too much masking fluid to remove, just on the eyes, on the ear and parts of the shirt. And before we move on to adding the details and the highlights, I do just want to add a little bit of shading onto particularly the highlights for the shirt, because in the reference they're really not that bright. So I'm going in with my brush pen and I've just got a little bit of colour on there, only a tiny bit, and I'm just using this to shade over those highlighted stripes, and I'm making it a little bit darker on either side and then more highlighted in the middle of that stripe. So I'm picking up a bit more paint and I'm working it throughout the either side, as you can see. Just to tone it down a bit so it's not so bright and so harsh, just to make it look a bit more realistic and a bit more natural looking. So you can see how bright the highlights in the eyes look, and it makes it look a lot more realistic. And it's just easier to do it like this than have to try and work around those tiny highlights. So I'm just going over all of those highlights on the shirt with a base wash of colour. And these little highlights would have been difficult to work around as well on the shirt. But that is it for this second part, and I'll see you guys in the next part where we'll be adding the details and the highlights. Hey patrons, welcome back to part 3 of this tutorial series, and in this part we're just going to be finishing off this portrait by adding some final details using a black watercolour pencil, and this is in the Faber-Castell Albec Duo range, I think that's how we pronounce it. And I'm just using the black watercolour pencil, and I'm going to be using this to mainly define the facial features and parts of the clothing and add a few more details to the hair as well. I'm not going to be doing any shading with this, like on the skin or anything. It's just going to be to darken up and define some of the details, add eyelashes, stuff like that, and little eyebrow hairs. I'm not going to be using this too much. So I'm starting off by darkening up the eyes. I'm going over the pupil. I'm crispening up the edge of the iris and that upper lash line. And I'm also going to be adding some shading to the eyelid crease as well. I've made sure that my watercolour pencil is really nice and sharp so that we can get in all of these small details. Now you can also use a coloured pencil for this, a black coloured pencil, but I'm using a watercolour pencil because I am going to be activating this paint with water in a few areas as well, like for example in the hair. And I'm going to be using a brush pen to do this, a clean wet brush pen. So I'm just adding a bit of shading, just a bit higher up that shadow between the eyebrow and the eyes. And I'm going to add a few little details to the eyebrow, just a few little lines to indicate individual eyebrow hairs and just to make the eyebrow look a bit more natural and like it's hair growing out of the skin. So I'm adding a bit of shading as well underneath the eye. and by the tear duct. And I'm just going to repeat the exact same process over on the other eye. Once again, going around the iris, filling in the pupil, tear duct, the upper lash line, the crease as well for the eyelid, and also below the waterline. And you can also add in a few eyelashes, making sure to focus on the direction the eyelashes are going in the reference image. So I'm just going to complete these steps and then I'll be back to talk you guys through the next step. So now I'm going to move on to adding some shading to the nose. So I really want to darken up that nostril. At the moment we haven't got in any detail for the nostril, we've just kind of added that shadow underneath the nose. So I've blocked in the nostril with this pencil, and I'm also going to use this to define the tip of the nose as well, and to darken up the shadows underneath the nose and on the side of the nose a bit more. I'm not pressing hard at all with this pencil. Now I am going to be using my brush pen to activate the paint here to make it even darker. Just darken up the side of the nose. And make sure that you're keeping your pencil nice and sharp as you do this. So now I'm going to go in with my water brush pen and I'm just going to activate this paint to make it all a bit darker and to intensify these shadows even more. Now this watercolour pencil is actually really dark. It really does become a lot more intense and a lot darker when you activate it with water. So if you don't want it to be so intense, you can go in with a bit of tissue and just blot over this so that the whole area is darker. And it stains it a bit, but it's not as dark as it is now. So that's what I will be doing in a minute. But for now, I'm just using my brush pen to bring that shadow up a bit further. So now I'm going to go with my tissue, a nice clean tissue, and just blot over the shadow. And I'm going back in with the pencil, just going over the nostril. Also lightening up that shadow underneath the nostril as well. Now I'm just going to go back in with a clean water brush pen and I'm just going to smooth everything out. And as you can see, that shadow looks a lot more natural and not too dark. I'm also going to blend over those shadows that we added to the eyes. So that upper lash line and around the iris as well. Just to make those colours nice and dark and rich. And I'm just repeating that same process over on the other eye. Now that we've finished the eyes and the nose, I'm going to move on to adding in the shadows to the mouth now. And we definitely need to darken up the centre part of the mouth. So I'm first just sketching over that area and I'm blending it out straight away with that brush pen, and you can see that that's made that a lot darker. I'm also blending it a bit further up using the brush pen onto that upper lip. And I'm also going to darken up underneath the bottom lip as well. Once again, blending it out with my water brush pen. And I'm also using the excess paint on that brush pen to add a few details to the lips. I'm now going to darken up the jawline. And the bottom of the chin. And I'm also going to work that watercolour pencil through areas of the hair as well, adding in a few more details. Now I'm activating that paint with the water brush pen on the jawline and the chin to start off with. This step helps to make the colour as intense as it possibly can be. I'm going to go in my watercolour pencil and add a few more details to the hair, adding a few little flyaway bits of hair going over the ear. I'm going to darken them up with that water brush pen and blend out that pencil. And I'm just going to continue to add a few more strands of hair using my watercolour pencil. And I'm going to keep blending it out with that water brush pen. Remember, you don't want to add too many details, otherwise you'll get rid of that expressive effect. But I'm just going to add a few within each section to indicate the direction the hair is going in. And then I'll come back to talk you guys through the next step. Now I'm starting to add some shadows to the clothing, using the exact same technique of applying the pencil and then blending it out. And the shirt has got a very like checkered look to it. So I'm just adding some vertical lines, going down across the collar using my watercolour pencil. And I'm also darkening up the sides of the collar as well, and the top of the collar. Adding some more lines throughout the middle section of the collar. Once again, blending it out with my brush pen. I'm also adding a little bit of that shadow onto the lighter stripes, just so that that pattern continues downwards. And I'm going to repeat that process for the bottom section of the collar as well, underneath that second white stripe. I'm just loosely getting in the pattern on the shirt. It doesn't have to be super realistic. So I'm just blending that out to soften it out a bit. And I'm just going back in with the watercolour pencil just to darken it up a bit more. Now I'm just darkening up the bottom of the collar and blending that out. So I'm just going to continue to darken up the collar until I'm happy with it. I'm also going to darken up the jumper as well. And I'm going to go over this highlight. So I'm adding some shadow underneath this left collar, over onto that little highlighted strip. And I'm going to move on to working on the left collar, again darkening up the shadow and adding some more stripes, some vertical stripes throughout the collar, even going over onto the white stripe to make it more of a realistic tone. So just repeat this process until you're happy with how the clothing is looking. I'm also going to add a bit more shadow just on the jacket underneath the fur collars, the fleecy woolen collars, just blending that out. Just to make the collar pop even more on that jacket. And I'm going to go back to finishing off the shirt as well. I also wanted to go in and darken up the shadows on the ear. I felt like they weren't dark enough yet, so I just shaded a bit of the black watercolour pencil onto the darkest parts of the ear, and I'm blending it out using the water brush pen, just so that the shadows on the ear are nice and intense. I also want to add a little bit of shadow under that highlight for the earring as well. So those couple of shadows on the ear just made so much difference to making it pop. If you're unsure where you need to go darker with your painting, then just take a photo of your drawing and look at the reference and just compare which areas aren't dark enough yet. So now that we've added in all of the shadows and details with the watercolour pencil, it's time to make the highlights pop using some gouache. I'm using the Winsor & Newton Designer's Gouache in the shade Permanent White, and I'm using a really thick consistency to get in these bright highlights. I'm starting off with the eyes, and I went over that highlight that we blocked off with the masking fluid, and I also added a tiny little highlight underneath our main highlight in both of the eyes, and I've gone over the upper crease as well, the eyelid. So I'm also going to be adding the highlights for the waterline, because in the reference the waterlines are quite bright. So I just want to brighten them up and clean them up with the gouache. The more water you add into your gouache, the more translucent it's going to be. So if you want a subtle highlight and you don't want it to be white or too bright, then mix in a bit more water. But if you want your highlight to be super bright, then try and keep the paint as opaque and thick as possible without adding much water. Now with the white gouache, it will dry darker than it looks when it's wet. So if you do mix in water to your gouache and it still looks really bright when you apply it to the paper, don't worry, it will dry more translucent. It always looks really bright and white no matter how much water you've mixed in when it's wet. I'm just adding a few little details with the white gouache over onto the eyebrow. And I'm just blocking in all of the brightest parts around the eyes. Now I'm going to repeat the same process on the other eye by getting in that waterline. And I'm also adding a bit of highlight to the white of the eye as well. Now this step of adding in the highlights is just really going to make everything pop even more, because we got in those really intense shadows, and then getting in those couple of bright highlights will just make all of the difference. I'm just highlighting the eyelid again on this side. Being very careful as I do this, because these details are really tiny. So don't put too much paint on your brush. So you can switch back to your watercolour pencil if you need to tweak anything or darken anything up even more. Now I'm going to move on to adding highlights to the nose. Like I've mentioned before, the highlight in the nose is in the middle, particularly on the tip of the nose. So I'm going in with my gouache and I'm just blocking in where that highlight is. I've mixed in a bit more water with this so that it flows easier onto the paper, is easier to blend, and so that it's not so bright. So I'm just looking at the reference to see where exactly the highlight is on the nose. What is the shape of the highlight? And I'm very carefully marking that in. Bringing the highlight a little further up. And making it a little bit wider, the highlight. You can always blend and tease out the edge of the gouache using a clean brush so that it's not so harsh and you don't have any harsh lines. So I've got a nice clean brush and I'm just going to blend out the edges and soften them out. Now I'm going to move on to adding the highlights to the lips. So for the mouth, there is a highlight directly above and going round the upper lip. You can see that I've mixed in more water into my gouache to make this a bit more subtle to start off with. We can always make it more intense by adding more layers. Like I've done, I've just picked up a bit more paint and I'm just outlining around the upper lip, the top lip. And I'm bringing that highlight further towards the right hand side of the face, where it is a bit lighter. Like I said before, the left hand side of the face has got more shadow hitting it, so the right hand side is in a bit more light. Picking up a bit more paint to make it even more opaque and to make the highlight brighter. And I'm cleaning up the shape of the nose as well with the gouache as I do this. Using a clean brush to blend this out so it's not just a harsh line. Going around the shape of the nose. And going over the shape of the nose with the pencil as well. Picking up a bit more paint and I'm going to highlight the tip of the nose even more, because as it dries you get a better idea as to whether it needs to be a bit brighter, because like I said, it's hard to judge whether the highlight is bright enough when the paint is wet, but once it dries and you can see how the gouache dries down, it's easier to identify whether you need to go even brighter. So that's why I said it's fine to work in layers, because you most of the time will need to go in and add more gouache, because you'll think it's bright enough when it's wet, but as soon as it dries you'll realise that it needs to go even brighter. Now I'm carrying on adding that highlight above that top lip and for the cupid's bow. Just blending that out. And again, I've got quite a bit of water mixed in with the gouache, so I do that highlight above the top lip. I'm going to keep intensifying the highlight on this right hand side of the face, just to keep it nice and bright. Bring that highlight further down by the chin as well. You can see that the paint is quite opaque because I want this to be a really bright highlight. Using a clean brush to just blend that out. And I'm just tapping a bit of that gouache into the centre of the bottom lip to add a brighter highlight. Adding a bit more gouache. And I'm adding that little highlight in the outer corner as well. Intensifying it even more with more gouache. And I'm going to add a few little lines to indicate some texture on the lips as well. Making sure to curve my lines with the curvature of the lips so that the lips look full and not flat. I'm going in with some thicker gouache and I'm just brightening it up above the top lip even more. And I'm going to blend out that line with a clean brush, just by teasing over the edges just to soften them out. And once again, I'm going to add another layer of paint to brighten up this section of the skin. And I'll keep blending it out, and then I'll come back to talk you guys through the next step. I'm also going to add a bit of highlight to the centre of the chin. And I also want to brighten up the jawline as well. Just a small part of the jawline. So I'm getting a bit of gouache and I'm just working it around just this small section of the jawline. Mixed in a lot of water to the gouache to make sure that it's nice and subtle. And I'm going in with a clean brush just to blend this out and soften out that highlight. You can also use a tissue to soften out the highlight as well. So now I'm going to create more of a highlight on the right side of the forehead and add a few little highlights throughout the hair as well throughout that hairline to tie the skin in with the hairline even more. And I'm using a clean brush to blend that out. So don't worry if you went a bit too dark in certain areas, because you can always use the gouache to lighten it up a bit. And now I'm going in with the gouache and I'm just adding in a few highlights to the hair. Firstly on this right hand side, adding a few little wisps going into the background. Making sure to keep following the direction the hair is going in. And I'm using quite opaque gouache for this, so that the highlights are nice and bright. And I'm going to repeat this process throughout the ponytail and throughout the rest of the hair. Making sure my lines are the same length as the hair. I'm just doing a few little wisps of hair within each section just to indicate the direction the hair is going in. It just helps to make the painting look more interesting as well. I'm also going to add a few little wisps of hair by the ear coming onto the face, and I'm also going to highlight the brightest points of the ear as well. Just to make sure the ear pops and is the right value. Continuing to add a few more wisps of hair. And I'm going to brighten up the centre of the chin. Using a clean brush to blend that out at the edges. And I'm going to continue to build up more layers of gouache on this section of skin. And I'm also looking at areas like the eyes, like the waterline, to see if I need to brighten up any of those features as well. I'm also adding some highlight above the eyebrow, creating little like hair strokes to indicate hair's growing rather than just a shape on the skin. Brighten up the jawline a bit. And I'm going to start to add more highlights to the shirt now. Just creating more of that checkered effect. That sort of tartan look. Just adding some vertical lines going down, making sure that they follow the curve of the collar, how the collar's falling and how it's curved. You can use tissue just to tone that down, and the pencil to shade over any areas that are too bright. I'm even using the brush pen to soften over the gouache to darken it up in places. And so I'm just going to repeat that same process over on the other side, on this other collar. What I'm doing now is I'm building up some highlights throughout the woolen parts of the collars of the jacket, and I'm just using a dabbing motion so that we still have that nice natural texture, that fleece texture to the collar. Now I only want to go in a few areas to add a few bright highlights because I don't want to cover up this cool salt effect that we created. So I'm just dabbing it in any areas that I want to brighten up a bit, and also to make more of a natural crinkled look at the edges of the collar so it doesn't look such like a line. So I just want to mess up the edges of the collar as well, make them look more natural and random. I just want to add more depth by creating some brighter highlights. And I'm going to do this process throughout both of the collars as well, just to add even more texture and to add more highlights. And I'm looking throughout the other parts of the jacket and I'm seeing if I need to add any highlights in those areas as well. So like I said, just repeat this process for both of those woolen collars. I'm now just adding a few more highlights to the hair. Some brighter highlights with the gouache. I'm adding some little wispy bits of hair going over onto the background. And now that the gouache has dried, we can see any areas that we want to brighten up even more. Any highlights we want to brighten up even more with the gouache on the hair. We want to make sure the hair looks nice and loose and a bit messy. So that's why we're adding those loose little flyaway hairs going over onto the face, over onto the background. And so we're nearly finished with this painting. I'm just making some final tweaks, and I do want to go in now and add in some splatters with my gouache. So I'm just tapping on the back of my paintbrush. The paintbrush is loaded up with the gouache, and I'm just tapping on the back of it just to create these cool little splatters to give a really nice magical look to the painting. Another thing that I did that I don't think was caught on camera is I just went over the background, as you can see, just in the corners, and I just went in with literally water and I just blended over that a bit more so that some of that salt effect wasn't so bright everywhere, so that it was more highlighted in the center of the background and then the outer edges were a bit darker. But I just literally went in with a large brush and I just swept and blended those areas out. Because even if the paper is dry, you can reactivate the colours a little bit by going over it with the brush quite a bit. So once again, I'm just making some final little details with the gouache. I'm looking at the reference, at my painting, seeing if there's anything else that I want to tweak or adjust. Adding in some larger splatters. You can even use your fingers to blend out the gouache as well. But that is pretty much it for this painting and for this tutorial series. I really hope you guys enjoyed this one and enjoyed following along. If you had a go at this, then I'd love to see what you guys created. You can post it on the community tab. If you have any suggestions for what tutorials you'd like to see, then let me know in the comment section. And yeah, thank you guys for watching and for all of your support. And here is the final painting. I'm really happy with how this one turned out. And I'll see you guys in the next tutorial series. Bye everybody.